Welcome to the Rob Sullivan Productions podcast. Today, I have a very special guest, Nate Teske. Nate and I met through my friend Ross Parr, and Nate is going to share his journey in sales and how that has led to the book that he's currently writing and the interviews that he's conducting to pass along the knowledge and everything that he's learned that has excited him about sales. So, welcome, Nate.
Good morning.
Good morning. Nice to see you, sir. So, you've had a really interesting career, and I love, the everything that you've shared about it. So, let's start with that in terms of, where you've been and how that's contributed to where you are now and what your next steps are, which are very exciting, by the way. I didn't want to spoil any of that.
Yeah, yeah. No, so I was in sales for 30 years, and back in one of my college summers, I was working in a hospital during the day, and what I termed on my resume environmental services, which was basically janitorial, mopping, sweeping and such. And then in the evenings, I was selling Cutco knives, which is kind of an interesting story because growing up, my mom always had Cutco knives. And actually, my girlfriend at the time, now my wife, her sister worked at the company, which is called Vector Marketing. And I sold those knives in the evening, and that's when I really got a taste of sales. And I'll talk a little bit more about it as we have the discussion this morning. But my favorite part about it was I went to a lady's house in an upper scale area, and she said, "Hey, Nate," she goes, "we're not going to buy anything from you. We just want to listen to your pitch. I'm helping out a friend because it was a referral from somebody." So I'm like, "Hey, no problem. That sounds good." So we get done, and as I'm wrapping up, she looks at her husband and she goes, "Let's get the big set." And it was called the Homemaker Plus 8, which I still remember it. It was a very expensive set, like a couple $1,000 or something. And I walked out, I'm like, "Holy cow." Like she said she wasn't going to buy anything. I didn't push her. And all of a sudden, got the huge sale, which is kind of funny. So I was kind of hooked on it from then. And that's kind of what led to my sales journey. And part of what that led to is after I retired in September of 2022, I had set a goal when I was 18, and I said I wanted to. When you're 18, you don't know anything. You think you do, but you don't. I said I'm going to retire at 50, and then fast forward through a lot of discipline, and my wife and I having the same kind of goal. I was able to do that, and I did it 2 weeks before I turned 51. So technically, it was 50, but I did it on my dad's birthday, so he'd have been super stoked that I made that decision. But after that, I did a little sales consulting and some stuff, but it was interfering with all my hunting and fishing and travel adventures, so I kind of scaled it back a bit. But I do a lot of posts on LinkedIn, and it's more for fun, frankly. And I've had people say, "Man, you should write a book. You've got really great stories." And a lot of my old clients have said, "You tell awesome stories." And that's what kind of led to this today, Rob, because I thought more about it, and I'm thinking, man, that maybe I should. And then I was talking to my lady about it, and and we were listening to I think we talked about this, Rob. I was listening to Michael McDermott's song "Unemployed," and there's a line in there where he goes, "I'm just about to publish my very first book," and then he goes, "I'm drunk again. I'm unemployed." My wife looks at me and she goes, "Hey, that's you." And I'm like, "What?" And she goes, "You're never going to write that book." And it was kind of funny. And then my one son, Mitch, he's like, "Dad, you're never going to write that book." I'm like, "Okay, it's on, son. I'm doing it." Just, kind of like, it's kind of stupid, I guess, but that kind of stuff gets under my skin. And as I started thinking about it, I kind of got excited. And we did a family trip to Montana back in for Christmas and New Year's, and we were there for a couple of weeks, 16 days, something like that. And on my flight there and home, I literally spent the entire time, kind of getting my thoughts down and how I wanted to structure it and all that. So, so that's kind of how I came up with that idea, and I'm pretty stoked about it.
It's a great idea for sure. I love that what you're sharing about uh, some of those stories because even the one that you shared just now about the knives, the thing that jumped out at me with
Yeah,
that is that it was when the pressure was off, when the person didn't feel like they were
right.
being sold to, is when the sale happens. And how many times, I can think of a
Yep.
bunch of examples off the top of my head where that was such a powerful thing for people, where they went in. I remember one guy in particular who went in and he was calling on a prospect that he didn't realize, he was new in the job, didn't have, through his research, he didn't realize that this person had actually worked with his company at a previous employer. So it would have been an enormous amount of research to uncover that. And the guy had a really bad experience. And so he
Hmm.
just yelled at him the whole time. And we talked about it afterwards because he was surprised that he walked out with the business. And I said, I'm not, because the fact that he was angry demonstrates to me that no one ever listened to him. And the fact that you were willing to spend 45 minutes listening to him with no expectation of selling anything is why you sold something.
Yeah. Hmm. For sure.
It's just really fascinating. So I'm curious. So to walk through, let's back to your journey. What are some of the other steps along the way when you look back? Because I firmly believe things are more clear in hindsight than they are when they're happening. What were some of those other signposts that led
Yep.
you to where you are now?
It's really interesting because I think Frank Sinatra song cycles. It really does happen that way. And I kind of broke up kind of my thoughts for the book. I'm breaking it into three chunks, like 3 decades actually. So the first chunk is when, I was a young buck and I was learning and kind of like a sponge trying to learn from as many of as I moved from job to job. I wanted to talk to all the top reps and figure out, what do you do that, makes you successful and why, why are you selling so much versus, someone else? And in that first kind of chunk, I mean, I'll be brutally honest, I was so focused on the commissions. That's all I gave a shit about. And it's not good to be like that because then you kind of get jaded about it. And I remember when I worked with Ross, actually, I was meeting a customer and I was talking to an existing client, and there was some new module. And every module back in those software days was $100,000, no matter what it was. Hey, we got this new functionality and it's 100K. And I remember I was talking to the customer, and I was just, to be very honest, I was just being a dick. I was pushing, pushing, pushing. And he goes, "Hey, Nate, do you need this deal so you can eat?" And I'm like, holy crap, am I being that much of a ding dong? So it was kind of funny because that first kind of 10 years, I was so focused on, what am I going to make? What am I going to make? And anyway, so that was kind of the first chunk. And then the second 10 years, that's when I started getting into the bigger deals, like the multi-million-dollar deals. And I remember I was so stressed about it that I actually had to go see a doctor because I was having like reflux and whatever. And he goes, "What are you stressing about?" I'm like, "Man," I said, "I got to sell these $1 million deals. And if I don't sell it, I'm going to get fired." He's like, "Yeah, but is it your $1 million?" I'm like, "No." And he goes, "So what are you worried about?" I'm like, "Okay, good point." But as I made that transition, it was more transactional in those first 10 years, where it was more higher volume and such. And when I started working on the bigger deals, that's when actually Ross was my VP, and he taught me something that I will never forget because we're talking about a particular deal or whatever, and we're getting ready for it, and he goes, "Hey," he goes, "let's just tell them if they want to say no, just tell us no." I'm like, "What are you talking about, man? No, I want to sell the deal." He goes, "Yeah, but," he goes, "it's kind of a reverse psychology thing." He goes, "If you push too hard, like I did with that other customer, and you're working on a big deal, just give them the okay to say no." And I started to do that. And it was really interesting because it was so disarming that people would be like, "Okay, if I don't want to do this, I can say no." Right. And as I got further in my career, part of it was I had gotten to my FU money number where I could walk away and not look back. And the pressure that I would put on myself, it was still there because I'm just wired that way. But as time had gone on, the more that I did that, where I didn't care about the outcome, and I cared about it obviously, but I didn't care about the outcome in the sense of this customer could sense it. Um, Once I did that, that's when things totally changed in the sense of the success just really, really started to turn on because they didn't feel that typical sales pressure where, if I say no to this guy, he's just going to bang on me on and on and on. And I've seen that, right? And I've done that, of course, in certain situations because it's just the nature of sales. But once I kind of made that mental shift of not caring about the outcome kind of in my head, it really changed quite a bit, because then it was like, okay, how can I help this customer? How can I make sure that they're getting what they need with what I'm selling? And from there, it just, everything works out when you have that kind of mindset. So that was a huge eye opener for me, because and that was kind of in the, I guess, the second part of that mid 20 years, my midpoint of my career. And then after that, that's when it really kind of turned on the jets, where it just kind of went straight up from there.
Oh, that's great. So I'm curious, what was the trigger when that finally that lesson from Ross really took hold?
You know, I wouldn't say there was a specific trigger, but one thing I found, a lot of times, because they're bigger deals, you're physically with the customer in a meeting room. This is before COVID and before a lot of the remote sales type thing. Um, but when you take that approach, and I actually remember I was with Ross, we walked into a meeting, and as we were preparing for it, I said, "Man," I said, "this lady that we're meeting with, she hates salespeople," and I heard it from someone that knew the gal. And I said, she thinks salespeople are slick and this and that. And as we're doing the introductions, Ross introduced himself, and he said, "Yeah," he goes, "I just want to say that, sales, in my opinion, is the most honorable, respectful job that anyone can have." And he went on, and I looked at him like, "What are you doing, dude?" And he did it in a very loving way. So it was kind of disarming from that standpoint. But I think kind of what I kind of came to was, when you like call a spade, or just acknowledge something, it just kind of takes it down a level, where you're not as, I guess, concerned and worried about, that type of perception. So and the other thing I would say too is, as I got further in my career, I focused more and more on the customer and what their issues were, and how I could help them. And I think the other thing is, when you have that approach with a customer, where you give them the okay to say no, and the solution you're selling may not be the right one. I remember specifically, I had one situation where we had a demo with the customer, and it was some new software component that we were coming out with, and it smelled like bull crap. And I called my sales engineer, and I said, "Hey man," I said, "is this thing going to work for the customer? Just yes or no?" He goes, "Honestly, no. But this is what we're doing, and in 6 months we're going to have the patches coming out and blah blah blah." And he goes, "At that point, it's going to work." So I called this lady back, and I said, "Hey," I said, the meeting we just had, the last hour we had talking to you about this new functionality, it's not going to work." I said, "We're going to come out with a patch in 6 months that, at that point it will." And it was like dead silence on the phone. And the lady said, "Nate," she goes, "I've been in this position, in that role in IT, for 25 years. You're the first salesperson in 25 years who's told me that you're not going to sell me something because it's not going to work." And I'm like, "Really?" I said, "Well, why is that?" And she goes, "Nobody says that," right? And I said, "Look, if I do that, all you're going to be is pissed off at me, and then you're not going to trust me, and you're not going to buy anything else down the road." And that customer ended up being a great client down the line, because the functionality came out, we ended up selling to them, and it was all goodness and light at that point. But it was kind of a culmination of things, but just the experiences that you have, it eventually kind of led me to that point where, when you kind of get in that situation where you're not caring about the outcome, even though I was deeply, but mentally, and portraying that to the customer, that's when things really started to change, because nobody wants to be quote unquote sold to, and forced into something, and I didn't want to be doing that either.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because what you're describing beautifully is a skill that a lot of people think they have, but they actually don't. And that is the ability to see the world from somebody else's point of view. That if you can,
Yep.
because a lot of times, you were literally putting yourself in her shoes and thinking, if I buy this and it doesn't work, this is not going to reflect well on Nate. And so many
Right.
times we do that, and or rather, we don't do that, and we're very focused on ourselves. I'll put people through the paces in workshops, and sometimes I'll say, uh, "Okay, forget it. You're not a salesperson anymore." I say, "You're the customer, and you've decided to partner with your company. Now we are your team. Tell us why you made the purchase." And it's fascinating how many times
Hmm.
people just like sometimes either the light bulb goes on and they immediately get it and they can talk about, oh, well, hey, you've talked about this problem and here's how it's going to help you with that and blah, blah. But sometimes they just look at you like, I don't know. And it's like, okay, you got to spend some time sitting and imagining that you are that person because that's what's going to create the shift.
Yep. Yep, for sure. I totally agree with that.
Yeah, so if I'm following correctly, we're halfway through the second part. I'm always fascinated by
Hmm.
transition. So talk to me about the transition from the second part to the third part, and if there's anything else from part two that we didn't talk about but should have.
Yeah. Yeah. So what's really interesting is as I when I was younger, I was as I said, I was so focused on the money side of it, and and saving and investing, and part of the way we were able to do that was my we lived on my wife's income and saved everything that I made. And when I say everything, it was almost like to a fault, where I remember
Wow.
one year I made a lot of money, and my wife was like, oh, she goes, you're going to buy something for yourself? And I'm like, no, why would I do that? And at the time I wanted a new shotgun, and it was like $1,700. And I remember I went to the store, and I had the 1,700 in cash in my hand in my pocket. And I walked in, and it was super busy at the store. And I'm like, I'm not buying it. I went home, and she goes, so did you get it? And I'm like, no, it was too busy. I said, I'm not buying it. And then I eventually ended up getting it. But it was funny because I kind of did it to a fault. But once I was at that, that FU walk away number, um, that's when like the pressure I was putting on myself, even though I put a tremendous amount of pressure on myself to be successful, but that pressure of you got to do it, Nate, go, 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 it wasn't there, right, from a financial standpoint. And that's when it really, it, I'm not sure how to articulate it best, but it really was that pressure and that urgency that you have. I still had it because that's just how I'm wired. That's how I am every day. But that urgency of we got to get this deal done, we got to get it done. When that kind of went away, so to speak, and I already had the financial situation to be able to to not close that deal and not worry about paying bills and such. That's when it kind of transitioned in that second half of my career, where I'm midway through that second decade, and plus I was doing bigger deals at that time as well, because the bigger the transactions are, the more eyes are on those transactions. And it was really interesting because, when you're doing transactional deals, you're working with one person and they make the decision, right? It's pretty simple. When you start getting into the seven-figure deals, and in some cases 10, there's a whole nother life that is taken on. And the other thing that I would say too is, as they say, I'd rather beg for forgiveness than ask for permission. There was a particular deal that I did later in my career, and we were working on the deal, and the customer was just super, super, I don't want to say skeptical, but concerned, because the product that I was selling, this was a service, and the solution they had ran their business, literally. And he's like, yeah, we're going to save X million dollars, but this runs our company. If this goes down, not only is it my job, but it impacts the entire business. And I told the guy, I want to say it was like $2.5 million or something he was going to save. I said, so are you saying the 2.5 million, doesn't matter? And he goes, well, not really, because, if the system goes down, we're $1 billion plus company, we're going to have a serious problem. And I'm like, okay, well, what if we did a trial? And we didn't do trials this particular job. I said, what if we did a trial? And he's like, well, what do you mean? I said, well, what if you paid something, because you're going to pay something. We're not doing it for free. Because if you do a trial for free, that customer has no skin in the game, right? So my colleague and I, we
Yeah.
just we literally just spitballed it in the meeting. And I remember specifically the client's like, that might work. And I'm like, oh shit, what do we do now, right? Because I put it out there and the guy wants to do it. But I had to babysit it for 6 months because they had an out clause and such. But when we did that, it kind of, it not only put skin in the game from their side, but they were able to try it. And if they didn't, I mean, they still would have paid us. I think it was like 750K or something. So it would have stung if they didn't do it. But as we went through and everything, and did that initial trial, I was on it so much. I mean, I spent 6 months just totally babysitting the everything. And at the end, they're like, okay, we're good to go. And they would have never done that had I not done that or taken that approach. And it was funny because I remember when I was working with Ross, I was a pretty young buck at the company, and we're going in to meet with a customer, and it was like it was $1.5 million deal. And I was new at the company. I was super like, I was kind of freaking out about like, well, what are we gonna talk about? And this guy, Dave, that was my manager, he goes, I don't know, man, let's just go talk to him. And I'm like, what? No. And when we did, that's what we did. We ended up getting the deal done. And I was like, holy crap, like that's not me, right? Because I over prepare in most cases. And when that happened, it was like, okay, sometimes people just want to be talked to and heard, like you said, right? You want to listen to them. Hey, here's our concerns. This is why we're not going to do it. If you're going to remove this concern, then we'd consider doing it. So I think you mentioned listening. That is, it's funny because my kids and my wife are like, "You're a terrible listener." I'm like, "No, it's I don't want to say selective, but um, like my clients, I would get complimented like, "Man, you're a really great listener, Nate." And I tell my wife, she's like, "Well, you don't do that at home," but she's obviously joking, I think. But that was a big part of it is listening to the customer and hearing what they're saying. And if you can't, I'll say it like this, if you can't position your solution, whether it's a service or an application or something you're selling, to address what their issues are, what their concerns are, I don't care how hard you push, they're never going to buy it. It's just the reality, right? And if you can position everything to their specific needs and how it addresses them, that's when, I mean, you'll get deals done. And in most situations, you'll get them done.
It really does make a difference because I, I firmly believe that one of the biggest mistakes sellers make at any stage in their career is that they have this fundamental belief that they're being paid to speak. Yeah. And if you turn it
Right.
around, your point about listening, if you believed you were being paid to listen, people would make more money.
Yeah, and one other thing I would mention too, as we're talking about talking and what have you, not caring about the income. There was a guy that I used to work with. He was a young guy. He was like a he would make cold calls and send emails and such to get me appointments. And he was a young buck, so I was helping mentor him about what to do, what not to do. And he's like, as I was talking about something, he's like, dude, there's this book that you got to read. It's totally about you. And he's talking about it. I'm like, well, what's it called? And he goes, it's called The Subtle Art of Not Giving a F. And then it's like asterisk CK. I'm like, really? I said, never heard of it. And at that time, I think it was a book on like old school book on tape or book on CD or something. And I listened to it, and it was just so funny because I'm like, yeah, that's kind of how I roll, is not not caring, even though deep down I cared, but just the like I said that mental detachment of the outcome. If you're able to do that, it just everything gets better, right? And you're listening better to the customer, and hearing what they have to say and learning about basically when you have the customer talking, they're going to tell you how to sell to them. It's just that simple, right? They go through all their issues and what their problems are. And in some cases, I mean, as I said about, telling that customer, I'm not going to sell them the software. In some cases, you are better off saying, you know what, let's regroup next year, depending on what you're selling, right? And
Yeah.
not shoving it down someone's throat and just banging on them because it's quarter end and it's the end of the most important quarter in the history of the company until next quarter. If you don't
Yeah.
if you don't do that, the customer respects you so much more.
Yeah. Absolutely. Because you're demonstrating in that moment that you are focused on them as opposed to focused on yourself. If I feel like somebody's focused on
That's right.
themselves, doesn't care about me, then the likelihood that I'm going to care about them is close to zero. Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
And one other thing too is I know AI is so prevalent with everything now. And frankly, I don't use it much. I should, and I'm starting to a little bit, but um, there's all these people saying, "Oh yeah, I don't need to have my sales development reps and the cold callers and such, and et cetera, et cetera." And in some cases, maybe that's true. But when it comes down to it, in if you're doing big deals, if it's transactional, maybe. But if you're doing big deals, there's always going to be a human to human connection, just because you're hurting cats in a lot of situations, and when when you're doing those types of transactions, there's multiple people involved, and it is extremely difficult because you can do everything right, and then there's one mistake and it's gone. It's just gone. I had a deal I worked one time where we literally had contracts ready to sign. And I remember my wife was like, "Oh, baby, how much you gonna make on that?" I'm like, I can't do that. I can't figure that out. And I figured it out, and I was gonna make, it was gonna be a huge, huge commission. And I figured out like to the penny, and I'm like, "Oh man," I'm like, "This is gonna be awesome," because they were ready to go. And then of course, you know what happened? It's bad usually to do that. So like they went dark for a week, and I finally got a hold of the guy. He's like, "Oh yeah, we're gonna hold off." I'm like, "Oh man, really?" And I told my wife, I said, "I'm never doing that again, baby, because it just, it's just bad karma when you when you do things like that." So
Yeah, absolutely. What are some of the, and I do believe that we learn most from our mistakes. When you think about that period or any of the periods that you
yeah,
were talking about, what's one that really stayed with you? Just like, there's some that I feel like you have to make only once, and there's some that you have to make multiple times before they really sink in. Talk to me about that.
yeah. So one that I'll never forget, and it was when I was at ADP right after college, which, ADP, I met the CIO for ADP years later, and he had a great comment. He goes, "ADP is the training ground for the technology sales world." And it was true because that job, it was mostly new college grads, at least the division that I was in. And, kids right out of college, and we'd have to go in on Monday mornings from 8 until noon and just literally make cold calls. And one of the guys I work with is like, "Yeah, we're stacking paper clips." And that's how he would kind of pass the time when he's doing the calls, is stacking paper clips, which weird comment, but I never forgot that. And as we would do that job, it was really difficult to get customers to, not only engage but also to sign. And I remember this person I was calling on. I was selling payroll service, right? I'm calling, and I get a hold of a guy, and he sounded distraught. And I'm talking to him, and I said, "Yeah, so how are you handling your payroll right now?" And he goes, "Well, my payroll person just died." And I'm like, "Oh my gosh." I said, "I'm so sorry." And he goes, "I need some time." So being a young guy, I waited not even a week. It was like days later, like probably 3 or 4 days later. I called him back and said, "Hey, I'm calling you about the payroll service." And the guy, I'll never forget this, Rob. He goes, "Nate, we just put her in the effing ground yesterday.
Ugh.
Don't ever call me again." And he hung up. And I'm like, "Holy crap, what is wrong with me?" Right. And it was kind of like, I just never forgot that moment. And, with respect to being a pushy sales guy, that was really early in my career. It was probably like the second year that I was there, if not maybe the end of the first year. So I was green as grass, 20 whatever years old, and didn't know anything. And that was like, okay, well, how do you handle that situation in the future, right? What I should have done was, "Hey man, I'm very sorry to hear that. When would be a good time to call back, because you need to kind of process this for some time." But I was just an eager young buck, and I hammered the guy, and he was like, he was not happy. So, there's moments like that you have where you just never forget them, right? And it always kind of stuck in the back of my head. I remember, and I try to keep things positive, but I have to share some negative stuff too, because just like you said, lessons learned. I remember I was working on something, and my manager's like, "Call him back, chop chop." And I'm like, "Chop chop? Are you kidding me?" So you know what I did? Nothing. Didn't call him back. Yeah, yeah, I called him. Yeah, I left a message, sent him an email. I didn't do shit, because it's like, really, you don't. That's not how the real world works. Because, if I, like your point about being in the customer's shoes, would you like that if somebody called you and said, "Hey, chop chop," and banging on you? No, you don't do that. So, but the comment I made earlier, where this is a Ross thing, where you tell that customer, "Hey, it's okay if you say no." It's so disarming that they're not used to hearing that from a salesperson, because the majority of the time your job as a sales rep is, hey, when they say no, you find out what the objection is and you crush it, you pound it, like the Glengarry Glen Ross
Yeah.
stuff, which you need to understand what their concerns are, but you just don't do that, because you don't like it when it's done to you. And I don't like doing it to customers, because it's just not, I just don't think that's the good way to operate. Now that said, you have to have timelines and I don't want to say pressure the customer, but I would say it's more of an accountability thing. And by that I mean I would hold everyone accountable. As I got further in my career, those bigger deals, like the second half of my career, I would be. My wife says it's me being a pain in the ass, and her nickname is Needy Nate, which I don't like that one, but um, I was very very demanding of my customers and also the internal people. So and I'll never forget it. We were traveling, and I kind of like this trip. Like today, I'm meeting an old colleague for lunch and a couple old colleagues for dinner and such tonight that are local here. When I travel, I try to, mix. I don't know if I'd say business, but sort of mix business with pleasure type thing. Anyway, we took a trip and we were in a location where the company that I work for had an office. I'm like, hey, babe, we're going to go take so and so out to lunch. One of the guys that helped me get some deals done, just to be nice, just good human thing. And I walked into the office to meet him, and the general counsel, which is the head of all the attorneys, he's like, hey, he goes, Nate Teske, what are you doing here? I'm like, oh, I'm just taking so and so to lunch, and this is my lady and stuff. And he looks at my wife and he goes, when Nate Teske calls my team, the ground shakes. And I'm like, what? He goes, yeah. He goes, my team is like, they're afraid of you. I'm like, afraid of me? Why? And he goes, because when you need something done, you call them, then you send an email, and then you send a text, and you're on them. And people are, these are legal, the attorneys. He goes, they know they have to get back to you, or you're going to just keep banging on them until you get what you need. Now, in those situations, you have to, right? When you're in that tornado of a big deal, you got to get shit done quick. And I remember people were just, people would kind of laugh about it, but it was true. I mean, they were, I wouldn't say they're afraid of me. They just knew that if I didn't get what I needed, I'd be on them until I got it. Like, for example, if an attorney says, hey, we'll get these comments back to you tomorrow at noon. Well, you better believe 11:59, I'm ready to go. I call them, hey, where's it at if it's not in my inbox, right? Because you have to have that when those bigger, more complex deals. There's a somebody I worked for at the time. At some point in time, they had they called it like the inertia of the deal, or I forgot the exact term they used, but that whole momentum of the deal. And time kills all deals is what they say. So when you are working that transaction, I would set up what I called like a transition timeline from the time, you have the first meeting with that customer, the time they sign the contract, and I would put it out into a spreadsheet. It was one of my colleagues that did the spreadsheet, and then I kind of, made it my own with tweaks and such. And I would send it to them, and I would have weekly sales calls. And what I would do is I say, hey, as we started to get into okay, we're going to engage and, do this engagement and vet whether or not we're going to buy from you. I would say, okay, well, we need to have a twice a week call. And they're like, holy crap, twice a week? Why twice a week? Well, deep down, I wanted once a week, right? So I kind of went higher, and then they're like, okay, we'll do once a week. You have a compromise. So every week, the first thing I'd have on the screen is, okay, here's where we're at. We completed all these things. And what it showed the customer and me, it showed that we're making progress. We're getting close to decision. And then it's like, okay, decision target is like February 15th. Are you going to do it or not by February 15th? And then you have to tweak it, things get delayed and such. But two things on that. One, the customer respects that you are not only on top of your stuff, but you're managing it and helping the timeline and getting to the end. But secondarily, it was more for me, or equally for me, because I was working other transactions and having that kind of structure to it. And making sure, if somebody needs to get something to you to get back to the customer by noon, you got to get it to them by noon, right? And if you don't, you call them, hey, I'm sorry, it's not going to come until whenever. And people respect that, because all too often people say things and they don't follow through, right? I mean, you tell a customer you're going to do X, Y, Z, you're going to call them back, and then you don't call them, and like 2 weeks go by, and that 2 weeks, your deal just kind of goes up in smoke. So having that accountability is so huge, and not equally for the customer and for your own internal team, because regardless of what you do as a salesperson, if you don't sell, nothing happens,
Yeah.
right? The entire company is reliant on you to get those deals done. And if you don't have that mindset of, this is the real world, right? If you don't do that, if you don't close your deals, you're eventually going to get fired, or, you're going to part ways.
Yeah.
on your terms or theirs. So you have to keep people accountable, and that's a big part of, I think, any type of a sales transaction, whether it's small deals or the big ones, holding people accountable.
Yeah, especially with the bigger deals. One of the things I've seen people do, and I love that you were talking about that weekly call because you can even take that a step further, make it a full-blown collaboration plan where it has steps in there that they have to do on their end that, if they're, so that regardless of whether they ultimately choose you in the deal, they still get value out of having partnered with you on that collaboration to get it done. But the odds are because you were, the
Yep.
one who was there and guiding them through the process, you upped your chances of actually getting the deal. Yeah. So,
Yeah, yeah. Because the other thing too that I've found, so many, well, everybody's busy, right? And if the more you can make it easy for them to do business with you, the better off your chances are. And it is extremely difficult. It's time consuming. It's really it's not easy. It's not easy to do that. And the more you can make it easy for them to go through that sales journey with you, um, the better off you're going to be. And it's and what it also does too is having that transition timeline. They're seeing it each week, right? And they know, hey, we're making progress. We're getting to the end. I'm not going to have to talk to Nate, for the next 2 years. We've got another month and a half, 2 years, and then we either do the deal or move on. But that just, I think it's, frankly, I think it's more professional because you're showing that you respect their time, but more importantly, your own. And I would say that to customers, look, your time's important and it's equally important to me. It's more important to me, right? Because everyone's selfish. And I don't want to waste your time or mine. And I would literally say that, Rob, to customers. I don't want to waste your time or mine because very few salespeople do that. And it's not easy to do. It takes some intestinal fortitude to walk away because everybody wants to close every deal they work on. It's just not going to happen though, right? And the more you give that customer the okay to say no, it's a little bit of a Jedi mind trick, but it does work extremely well because it's disarming to both sides, right? We're all professionals, we're grown-ups. If you don't want to do the deal, then that's fine. Let's move on. But giving that okay, like I've been saying, it's pretty powerful from my experience.
absolutely. And if you have, if you built into that plan a few moments where you have to look at each other and say, are we moving forward or not? That go, no go decision. You can, as the salesperson, you can be the one to say, we're not moving forward. Yeah, not every customer is a good customer.
Right. That's right. That's right. It's very difficult to do that because
Oh yeah.
sometimes you just don't know if that's really the case or if you're.
Yeah, there's a lot of intuition that goes into some of that, I think. I don't think I know. I know there's, if you work your
Absolutely.
intuition, it's a good place to start, certainly. So I'm curious. So take me through then, stage three. What were some of the big aha moments there and insights, mistakes, anything you want to share?